I want to start by giving a quick shout out to comrades in the room. QP3903 is on strike at York University right now. There's comrades from People's Defence organizing in Scarborough, which is part of the city of Toronto. There's Jamhoor, who's trying to start a publishing platform for radical South Asian politics. And I know there's other comrades in this room involved in other struggles. Speaking of comrades, any of you who have run into leftists, especially Marxists, probably have come to the conclusion that they're kind of weird, right? They kind of speak this language which is so rarefied, so theoretical, so high up in the air that sometimes you wonder what it has to do with the struggles of people on the ground. That's been a criticism of Marxists. It's often so theoretical. Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party says, we need to speak in plain proletarian workers' language. But when you go out into the when you go out down into the streets and you see these people selling papers about Trotsky said this to Stalin, you're like, what does that have to do with me? Or, what is a Maoism and why does it exist? Or what is the law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and why can't you just call it robots? Those are questions about how is it that Marxist theory is actually relevant to people on the ground. The paradox is that at least in the third world, even in the first world, but certainly in the third world, the largest organizations, consistently the largest organizations of working people, of people from lower classes, have been those that have been led by Marxists, especially those associated with the Soviet Union and China, Stalin and Mao. So, for all the stuff that Trotskyists talk about, or all we talk about in terms of plain proletarian workers' language, it's precisely these rarefied theoretical intellectuals who've led millions of people, and to this day continue to lead millions of people in the third world. Pakistan never got to that level, and my presentation is about a party in Pakistan called the Mazdoor Kisan Party, which was the largest and perhaps most effective far left or leftist party in Pakistan. Why it wasn't able to achieve success, why it failed, I think is an important question. And one that responds to Mavish's earlier posing of the dichotomy between marginalized geographies and lineages of the past. So I'm looking at the Pakistan Mazdoor Kisan Party in the 1970s, but its base was in northwestern Pakistan, which is a marginal area. We've talked a little bit about it earlier in the morning. But the MKP mobilized tens of thousands of peasants in the NWFP, if not hundreds of thousands, and it certainly had thousands of supporters in other parts of the country. So for whatever it's worth, it's quite small compared to the millions that Indian communists have been able to mobilize. It was still, in some ways, at least numerically, the most advanced. So we have to inquire into what was going on there. So what my talk is going to be about is looking at the theoretical language of the MKP, which is available in their copious documentation. They wrote a lot and wrote at each other a lot. And the distinction or the distance between what they're writing and what the people who were actually involved in the movement, the peasants, the workers, who many of them are still alive, so you can just go talk to them and be like, hey, what was this about? And they'll tell you. Or they'll not tell you. And the silences, the ways of remembering things, the differences of interpretation are themselves interesting and revealing. So I'm looking at that distance, and what I'm going to argue or try to tell you is that as rarefied, as abstract as that theoretical discussion can seem sometimes, it often provided a very powerful way of understanding the world, of understanding the conditions of working people, and understanding how are we going to push forward and lead them. And that distance between plain people's language and theoretical language is not always as far as it seems. At the same time, you only get the answers to the questions that you're asking. And so sometimes the theoretical language that you're using can actually stop you from asking questions. I know, because in my fieldwork, all I asked about was class. And I forgot to ask about ethnicity, and I forgot to ask about tribe, and I forgot to ask about everything else. It's not true, I didn't forget to ask, but it wasn't my focus. And so the answers I got were driven also by the questions that I was asking. And so I'm going to start by maybe a lot of folks here. what's at stake when we're talking about Maoism? Why do we even talk about Maoism? Why is Maoism important to study? Here, this is the cover of one of the NKP's internal journals. It says, Fikre Mao zinda hai, painda hai. What does painda mean? Right. So the thought of Mao is alive and it's everlasting. And this was published right after Mao died in 1976. In Pakistan, in northwest Pakistan, in Punjab, this is being circulated. So it's also a question of the circulation of ideas across the communist world. What's at stake with Maoism? Why is it still relevant? Why is it that in 2010, Manmohan Singh could say that the greatest internal security threat to the Indian state, the Indian bourgeoisie, the Indian capitalist class is Maoism? There's something about it that we have to come to terms with. We don't have to agree with it, but we have to come to terms with it. And to do that, we have to go back to the 1960s and understand the difference between mainstream, mainline communism, whose representative will be speaking later today, and Maoism. And there's basically this thing that happened in the 1960s called the Great Debate between the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the world's largest Communist Party, and the world's next largest Communist Party, the Communist Party of China. They're debating with each other, disagreeing with each other. Why? What's at stake? It's because the Soviet Union is now saying, look, to revolutionaries in the third world, here are 3 guidelines to you. Number 1, socialism can be achieved through peaceful means. Okay? Number 2, socialism can be achieved through parliament. And number 3, the task of communists in the third world is to support the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class of your country, against imperialism. China responds and says, socialism cannot be achieved through peaceful means. Good luck. Socialism cannot be achieved through parliament. We're not saying stay out of parliament, but we're saying if you think you're going to achieve socialism through passing laws in a bourgeois parliament, good luck. And the last thing they're saying is, sometimes you need to ally with the national bourgeoisie of the country. That's true. But if you think that you're going to go under their leadership and they're going to tolerate the existence of working class parties and not just kill you, good luck. Working class needs to organize its own independent party. It needs to lead the movement for national liberation. It does not follow the national bourgeoisie. It leads the national bourgeoisie. Okay, Noaman, thanks for that lecture. How is that relevant? What does it have to do with the conditions that people are facing on the ground? In Pakistan, this takes the terms of a debate, and Madiha referenced it earlier in her talk, which is in the 1960s and 70s, the Pakhtuns, or a section of the Pakhtuns, are saying we are facing national oppression from the Punjabis, who, by the way, are allied with the American imperialists. So we are for our national liberation and for our liberation from American imperialism. But who are these people who are talking about Pakhtun nationalism and Pakhtun liberation? By and large, these are the Khans, the landlords of the northwest frontier, and specifically of the Peshawar Valley. They're saying, so the pro-Soviet communists, the Soviet Union-aligned communists are saying we need to ally ourselves with these landlords because they face national oppression from the Punjabis and they're against American imperialism. The Maoists were saying, okay, maybe these Pakhtun Khans face national oppression. But what about the oppression and exploitation that their workers and peasants face from those Khans? Are we supposed to wait for some next revolution before we go after this? The conditions that faced peasants and workers were described to me as Khanism. They said this was a condition of slavery. Landlords owned thousands of acres of land, thousands of acres. They still do, in fact. They had unpaid labor was mobilized from peasants and workers. If you got married, you had to pay a tax to the Khan. If the Khan got married, you had to pay a tax to the Khan. They had nazirs, overseers, who checked everything. You couldn't sell things on the market. The market was the Khan. The Khan was the market. You had to sell to the Khan. Women's labor was mobilized. So women were working at home, they were working in the fields, and they were working for free for the Khans. You couldn't build a home. Many peasants were absolutely poor and landless, workers were often poorer. So the Maoists said, we're not supposed to fight the Khans. We're supposed to wait until we fight America. How is that supposed to happen? No, we were going to fight both. We're going to fight the Khans and we're going to fight the Americans. That's what we're going to do. That's what was at stake on the ground, is how do we fight this system of Khanism that is oppressing the peasants and workers, the lower classes right now. And so that's what the MKP did. The Mazdoor Kisan Party actually split from Bacha Khan's party. They split from the Ethno-Nationalist Party, National Awami Party, and they formed the Mazdoor Kisan Party in 1968. And they led a movement due to a whole bunch of things coming together, convergence of many factors, randomness. They led a movement that became a low-intensity conflict in northwestern frontier province. So Khans would say to me, it was like the Taliban. The Taliban today is what the MKP was back in the day. So one Khan said to me, he said to me, this whole area was red. It was covered with the red flags of the MKP. The peasants refused to let us or our nazirs, our overseers, onto the lands. The authority of landlords in the villages collapsed. It was done. What this meant, I should show you where this is happening, by the way. So this is Northwest Frontier Province. It's a whole bunch of things that make no sense. That red square is Charsadda. That's the epicenter of the movement. It spread a bit further to the north, a bit to the east, actually a lot further to the north, all the way to the tip, that green tip up there. This is Charsadda. This map's from 1926, but it's still the best map I can find. The British did something really good. And this is Hashnagar. So this part of Charsadda is Hashnagar, and it's called the Hashnagar Peasant Movement. So in one instance, in July 1973, 1,200 peasants faced off against the paramilitaries of the state and the landlords' goons in Malakand, which is north of Charsadda. And they fired at each other for 11 hours. This is just one example of many battles that they fought to liberate the land from the landlords. And they did. In many areas, peasants stopped paying rent entirely. In other areas, no rent increases. And in other areas, no ejections, evictions whatsoever. In effect, the peasants became the controllers of the land. You could not move without the peasants. Okay, so this is what was at stake in terms of Maoism. This is, stuck. Oh, here you go. This is what we're talking about. So this rally was held in 1972. And this rally had 9,000 to 10,000 people, according to police estimates. According to peasant estimates, they were like, there was 100,000 of us there. I'm sure there were, buddy. But you see in the top right picture, imagine those sticks were red. Imagine those hats were red. This whole area was red. So, there's a saying in India, Hamro bari, tumro bari, Naxal bari, Naxal bari. There's a Naxal bari was an area where the Maoists started things. In Pakistan, it was Hamara nagar, tumhara nagar, hash nagar, hash nagar. Our nagar, your nagar, hash nagar, hash nagar. What does nagar mean? It means something interesting. So their demand, their demand was this land to the tiller demand. What I want to talk about in terms of memory, though, apparently I have 5 minutes to do this, but I'm not sure I'm going to do it, so I'm going to take more time. It's fine. The land to the tiller, this by this way says, "Jera wahe uhi khawe," which means the person who sows shall reap. Often when we talk about vanguard parties and Marxist parties, we talk about it in terms of, oh, look, these elite vanguardists have betrayed the people and they take them in the wrong directions. What if we flip the script and we say, these people betrayed the vanguard party? Interesting thing. Here's this guy. He's the leader of the Mazdoor Kisan Party in Northwest Frontier Province. His name is Afzal Bangash, born 1924, died 1986. He was extremely popular. He was so popular, a lot of people would just tell me randomly, Bangash was an angel. One person said to me, Bangash was like a devta to us, a god. So look, we're in Northwest Frontier Province, better known for the Taliban and for the patriarchal oppression of women. And this guy's saying, this guy was our god. This is shirk, right? This is a sin. This guy was why? Because he delivered the land to us. He died in 1986 and he was buried in his home district of Kohat. But as soon as he was buried, a couple of months later, his followers from Hashnagar came, they got his body, and they took it back to Hashnagar and buried it here. This is his grave in Hashnagar. Except it's no longer his grave, because 25 years later, in 2011, his sons came and said, we want to take our pops' body back home. And so they did. They dug it up. But there were hundreds of people there, if not thousands. And one old communist activist said to me, MKP activist said to me, at some point he had tears in his eyes, and he said, my brother was there. And in the plain sight of hundreds, we saw that the body had not decomposed. There was a fragrant smell coming from the grave. Bangish's hair had grown, his beard had grown. It was as if he had just been buried. With tears in his eyes, he said to me, Bangish was an angel. He didn't take a thing from the people. I was like, this is a nice story. I asked around and people were like, yeah, that happened. Yes, that happened. I'm like, I still don't believe it because, superstitious weirdos. So I went and I talked to Bangish's son, Kamil Bangish, who said, yes, that's pretty much what happened. So what's going on here? Why has Bangish become this saintly figure? One thing that was interesting, I spoke to this one, often I would talk to peasants and they would say, Khet Mazdoor ke saath theek nahi hua. That in the movement we had peasants and we had landless laborers. And the landless laborers were not treated well. What does it mean to say that in the passive voice? The landless laborers were not treated well. Who didn't treat them well? We didn't treat them well. The tenants, the peasants didn't treat them well. Why? Because once the peasants got their land, they stopped fighting. They didn't want to fight for more land. They didn't fight for land for the landless laborers. So it was seen as a betrayal of the landless laborers. And then I was speaking to a landless laborer, and I said to him, aren't you upset with Bangish? Because he was saying to me, Bangish, all credit goes to Bangish. Bangish is the one who made this movement possible. He awakened the sleeping people. He gave people's awareness, motivated them, and they stood up. But Bangish let you down. He didn't do justice to your people. And he said, no, actually, our people did not do justice to Bangish. They abandoned him. And in fact, that is pretty much what happened. By 1974, a new government co-opted the peasant movement, gave peasants land rights in a complicated manner, forced the landlords to compromise. So what we have here is a story of a man who comes from above. He unites the peasants and the workers. He gets the peasants their land, but they betray him. They betray each other, and they go back to their sinful ways. Is this not the story of a saint? Is this not the story of a wali? So that's one way to think about it. But this is how Bangish talked about it. Modes of production, right? If you want to get a communist excited, just go up to their ear and go, modes of production. They're like, oof. Yes, you can control my means of production anytime. So this is inappropriate jokes. What's going on here? There was a debate in the Mazdoor Kisan party precisely because of this. And opposite to Bangish was Sherli Bacha, who's the most intelligent Pakistani leftist in my opinion, hands down. Most of his stuff is in Pashto, so you can't read it. But if you do, you would understand that this guy is the most brilliant theorist of the Pakistani revolution, in my opinion, again. But Punjabis don't know because they don't know. Here you go. This is a quick course. I have 2 minutes. So it's a quick course in Marxist agrarian political economy. This is what the rural structure looks like. You've got landlords on the top. Peasants are not one class. They're actually 3 classes. And you can actually see them if you go to the peasantry, and you can measure this if you have time and a calculator. There's rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants. Rich peasants have more capital, they have more land. Poor peasants have less capital, less land. And then there's landless laborers at the bottom of this. Okay, it's very schematic. I'm sorry. Now, generally your revolution says we need to unite the peasants and the workers against the landlords. Okay, cool, so we do that. What happens? The landlords fade away. But then now who's the dominant class in the villages? Those with the most capital are the rich peasants. And the idea is that they actually transition to become capitalist farmers. So do landlords. So now the interests of these landlords and rich peasants are converging. So Sherli Bacha says, look, what we actually need to do is organize the landless laborers independently and antagonize them, again, not antagonize, but bring them into contradiction with the rich peasants. This is how the revolution is going to move forward. And Bangish says, okay, that's nice. The problem, though, is that the landlords are still there. We haven't eradicated them as a class. So do we fight the rich peasants, or do we unite with the rich peasants? And even if you eradicate the landlords as a class in one part of Pakistan, you haven't done that in all of Pakistan. So how can you take this and universalize this across Pakistan? And it's an important debate. It's a real debate. But this debate actually reflects what's going on. The language of betrayal between landless laborers and tenants. Remember, these are, it's not a question of caste. In Punjab, caste separates the landless laborers from the peasants. In Pakhtunkhwa, it's not the case. They're from the same caste. They're from the same tribe. They're brothers. They're cousins. They're neighbors. And they've betrayed each other in a sense. But we understand this through this Marxist language. That's how it was understood. Now, I have no particular insights to give about how that debate went. It went disastrously. Both of them lost. And then the military regime came and crushed everyone. Actually, it was more complicated than that. They got themselves arrested, all of them. They were really weird. They had bad strategy and bad tactics, so we can talk about this later. But I just want to stress again, the contradictions amongst the people were reflected in the theory of the party. And the theory of the party was reflected in the people. There's all kinds of mediations going on, but it's not a case of this is theory here and this is the plain people's language here. They speak to each other. They change with each other. At the end of the day, though, when we explain things in terms of material interests, when we explain things in terms of modes of production, the question is, are we actually letting peasants off the hook? Because, material conditions determine your ideology, right? So what else can they do? But maybe, speaking of Bangash in religious terms is also a way of letting peasants off the hook. After all, who can live up to the example of a saint? So, God bless everyone.